It's the most suspenseful trial in Star Trek history as we watch to learn if Worf, the guy who was always threatening to kill people, meant to kill people. This is a review of the Star Trek Deep Space Nine episode Rules of Engagement. If you have not seen this episode, and you don't want to know how many Dabo girls Dr. Bashir could potentially have been chatting up, be warned. Spoilers beyond this point. Now, let's review the events of Star Trek A Few Good Worfs. We begin with Worf having kind of a trippy experience, running through the corridors of the Defiant, batleth in hand, seeing visions of dead crew members, celebrating Klingons, and then dead Klingons on the bridge. Then he wakes up. It was all a dream. He's in a holding cell in the security office. Odo's there like, "You'd better try to get some sleep. Tomorrow's a big day. Your hearing starts in 4 hours." That hearing, as we'll soon find out, is to decide if Worf should be turned over to the Klingon Empire to stand trial for the thing he did that we'll talk about in a minute. But before we get there, you might be wondering why Worf is locked up, pending an extradition hearing. It doesn't seem like Starfleet intends to punish him for what he did. It's just a hearing to determine whether or not the Klingons should be allowed to punish him. So why is he in jail? The little-known answer is that it has nothing to do with the extradition hearing. Worf was arrested for public intoxication, and not for the first time. They never actually show it, and it is, I admit, implied but faintly, if at all. But Worf is basically the Otis of Deep Space Nine. Odo even gave him the access code to security so he can lock himself up until he dries out. The irony is, when he was still on the Enterprise, Worf was the one in the sheriff role, and the Otis was, I don't know, let's say Miss Kyle. The hearing is called to order when the Admiral presiding dings a bell on her desk. I don't care for that. I prefer the Orb of Justice from that last episode I reviewed. Justice should arrive with a sharp crack, not a series of chimes. Anyway, this hearing is taking place because, not too long ago, Worf blew up a Klingon civilian ship while he was escorting a relief convoy. The Klingons, represented here by Ch'Pak, claim that Worf acted with negligence when he fired upon the civilian ship and is responsible for the deaths of 400 and something Klingons aboard it. Worf, represented by Captain Sisko, is counterclaiming that it was no big deal and the Klingons should just get over it. Ch'Pak tells the Admiral that he isn't disputing Worf's version of the facts of the case. The Defiant, under Worf's command, was escorting a medical relief convoy through Cardassian territory when 2 Klingon birds of prey attacked. This is during the period when the Klingons were at war with the Cardassians, remember. The birds of prey were cloaking and uncloaking during the battle, so when a ship uncloaked directly ahead at one point, Worf immediately fired on it, destroying it. Only, whoopsie, it wasn't a bird of prey decloaking, it was a civilian transport. The crucial point for the Klingon Empire, says Ch'Pak, is not what Worf did, but why he did it. When he ordered the Defiant to fire on that decloaking ship, was he acting as a Starfleet officer, defending a convoy, or a Klingon warrior, thirsty for combat? Because if it was the second one, only the Klingons are fit to judge him. Ch'Pak begins to call witnesses to support his case that Worf was all up in his warrior's bloodlust during the incident in question. His first witness is Dax, and it's here that we are introduced to this episode's big stylistic flourish. When witnesses testify at the hearing, their testimony is illustrated by scenes depicting what they're describing, and when they are asked questions by Ch'Pak or Sisko, they answer by directly addressing the camera. I think it's an effective technique. But then again, I usually like it when characters in movies and TV shows talk to the camera. It makes me feel seen. Ch'Pak asks Dax about Worf's predatory instincts. She talks about their sparring sessions in the holosuite, and how, when they fight, they really fight. And she knows that Worf has it in him to kill her, but he always holds back. He knows when to stop. He can restrain his killer instinct. With Dax still on the witness stand, Ch'Pak says to the Admiral, "May I introduce evidence that I stole from Worf's private files?" The Admiral's like, no, you can't introduce private information unless you obtained it through a search warrant. Or you got permission from the person it belongs to, of course. So, Chapok turns to Worf and says, will you allow me to introduce this evidence I stole from your private files? Or are you a great big wussy boy who wets his bed at night? Sisko whispers to Worf like, that's not in the files, is it? The bedwetting thing? Worf says to Chapok, use whatever you've got, I have nothing to hide. Sisko's like, what are you doing, man? You don't just give the other side evidence you don't have to give them. Worf says, relax, it's all good. I clear my browser history every night. That's not how that works. The evidence Chapok shows to Dax is a record of another holosuite program Worf likes to use, a recreation of the historic Klingon Battle of Tong Vei. Under questioning from Chapok, Dax reluctantly admits that the Battle of Tong Vei ended with the Klingon Emperor Sompek ordering his troops to burn the town and kill all of its inhabitants, including civilians, including children. And when Worf plays the program, he assumes the role of Emperor Sompek. And when the time comes, does Worf, as Sompek, give the order to massacre the people of the town? Yes, says Dax. And when was the last time Worf played that program before the mission they're talking about here? The day before he left. Okay, admittedly that doesn't look good, but just because Worf enjoyed mass murdering civilians in the holosuite, that doesn't mean he'd do it on purpose in real life. It's just a video game. I'm not a gamer, but I played some Vice City back in the day, and my favorite way to play was to ignore the mission and just maraud through the city beating cops to death with a baseball bat, and it was a blast! It was fun, it made me feel good about myself, I loved it. I loved it! But does that mean I'm going to go on a baseball bat wielding rampage against police officers in real life? Of course not. I'd never get away with it in real life. Things get worse for Worf when Quark testifies. After struggling to remember which of 3 possible Dabo girls Dr. Bashir was hitting on, before deciding it was actually a 4th Dabo girl and she was talking to Morn, not Bashir, Quark describes how Worf came in and ordered his customary prune juice, and then they got talking about the convoy mission, which was coming up soon. Quark says to Worf, what if the Klingons attack the convoy? And Worf says, I hope they do. I would fuck somebody up. So far, we've got Worf having fun ordering a genocide in a video game right before leaving on the mission, and Worf telling Quark he hopes the Klingons start some shit with him on the mission before leaving on the mission. But what about what happened during the mission? For that, Sisko calls Chief O'Brien as a witness. O'Brien was stationed on the bridge of the Defiant when the Klingon birds of prey attacked the convoy. He describes how the Klingons used a cloak and run technique, swooping in, firing, then cloaking and moving off until the next attack. When O'Brien detects a ship decloaking directly ahead, Worf immediately orders to fire torpedoes before the ship is fully visible. When the ship explodes, it becomes obvious that it wasn't a bird of prey, but a civilian ship, and everyone on the Defiant is stunned and horrified. O'Brien says he stands by Worf's decision to fire given the circumstances, and he doesn't doubt his motives at all. Worf is an honorable man, O'Brien insists. He would never have intentionally fired on an unarmed ship. This was an accident, resulting from the heat of battle and that civilian ship being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Chapok asks O'Brien, sure, you support Worf's decision to fire on that decloaking ship, but do you agree with it? If you had been in Worf's position, if you had been in command of the Defiant at that moment, would you have done the same thing? O'Brien protests, saying it's not the same thing. He's reviewing the situation with the benefit of hindsight, not faced with a split-second life or death decision in the moment. But after Chapok insists, O'Brien admits that no, he would not have done the same thing. He would not have fired on the decloaking ship until he knew what it was. It's definitely not looking good for Worf now. During a break, Chapok approaches Sisko at the Replimat and says, hey, we both know Worf is screwed, so why don't we make a deal? You concede, let me take him back to the Klingon homeworld, and I'll make sure that he doesn't get a death sentence for killing those civilians. I'll even defend him myself at his trial. I don't give a shit which side I'm on. I practice law for the thrills, baby. Sisko turns down the offer, and when the hearing resumes, he calls Worf to the stand. Worf acknowledges that he knew it was likely the Klingons would attack the convoy, and he was eager for the possibility of battle, but he is first and foremost a Starfleet officer, and he would never allow his personal feelings to interfere with his duty. Worf also says that he knew the convoy's route would take it through civilian shipping lanes, but he considered it very unlikely that they would encounter any civilian vessels during a battle. That being the case, when the attack started, he decided to fire on decloaking ships without hesitation to protect the convoy and his own ship and crew. When Sisko asks Worf if he would do anything differently, Worf says no. Ch'pak takes his turn and says, "Let's cut the shit, Worf. Other Klingons hate your guts because you were raised by humans, you wear the Starfleet uniform, you've sided against your own people, you're just a traitor to your kind, aren't you?" Worf's like, "No. I have lived among humans most of my life, but my heart is Klingon." Ch'pak says, "If your heart is Klingon, why aren't you happy about killing all those civilians? We Klingons love killing people. It's kind of our thing." Worf says, "There's nothing honorable about killing someone who can't defend themselves. I would never attack a defenseless opponent." Ch'pak says, "Oh really? Not even if they called you a pants-pissing little coward who blew up a ship full of children to prove to himself that he was a man?" Worf says, "No, but are you saying that about me right now?" And Ch'pak says, "Yep." And Worf jumps out of the chair and knocks Ch'pak across the room. Ch'pak sits up like, "I've got this motherfucker now. Hey, Worf, I thought you said you'd never attack a defenseless opponent." "Admiral, I rest my case." Sisko is in his office waiting on the Admiral to make her decision, wondering how the Klingons are going to execute Worf exactly. Beheading? Drawing and quartering? Stoning? All of the above? When Odo comes in and hands him a pad and says, "Good news. Odo has spent the episode investigating the captain and all the passengers of the transport Worf destroyed. Apparently, he's finally found something." At Sisko's request, the Admiral reconvenes the hearing so he can introduce this new evidence. Sisko calls Ch'pak to the stand and hands him a list of names, which Ch'pak recognizes immediately as the names of the people who were on the transport ship that Worf blew up. Sisko's like, "Wrong! Those are actually the names of the people who were on a transport ship that crashed 3 months ago." He hands Ch'pak another list and says, "This is the list of the passengers on the ship that Worf blew up. Isn't it weird that both lists are identical? Are we supposed to believe that all of these people miraculously survived the first crash? Then a few months later, they all decided to take another trip together on the same ship, and that ship got destroyed in a battle? That's pretty far-fetched, right? Isn't it possible that instead of that, what really happened was that those names were used to falsify a passenger list for the ship Worf destroyed, because in reality, there were no civilians on that ship, and this was all staged to make it look like Worf had massacred civilians so that Starfleet would be forced to stop escorting relief convoys and the Klingons could move in unchallenged and take control of that strategically valuable star system? Ch'pak's like, "Yeah, I guess." Case dismissed! Later, Sisko visits Worf aboard the Defiant, and Worf says, "You know, I've been sitting here thinking, and now that my ass has been pulled from the fire, I realize that Ch'pak was right. I did have something to prove. When he provoked me during the hearing, he was giving me what I wanted, an excuse to whip his ass. And when I commanded the Defiant to escort the convoy, it was the same. I was hoping the Klingons would attack, and I was glad when they did. I shouldn't have accepted that mission." Sisko's like, "Is that all you shouldn't have done?" And Worf says, "No, I shouldn't have had unprotected sex with Kalar either." Sisko says, "Right, obviously, but more recently." Worf says, "I shouldn't have fired on that ship as it was decloaking. I should have verified that it was a legitimate target first." Sisko says, "Good job. I mean, bad job, but good job at recognizing that you did a bad job. Always verify the target You knew there could have been civilians around, and you placed those civilians at risk to protect your ship and your crew, and we're Starfleet, and we don't do that shit. We only endanger civilian lives to pressure former officers who have betrayed us into surrendering, and that's it. You got it? Yes, sir. Sisko says, good. Now, relax, because the truth is, you got lucky this time, and you didn't actually kill any civilians. So, try to be less trigger happy in the future, and you'll make a fine captain someday. Now let's go party! The end! Rules of Engagement is interesting when considered in the context of other Star Trek Courtroom episodes of its era, because most of the others produced during the TNG and post-TNG years use the trial or hearing or whatever they call it as a platform to examine deeper themes. The Measure of a Man and the Drumhead tell stories about human rights and legal rights and tolerance and justice. Dax uses its makeshift courtroom to delve into questions of identity. Other episodes I'm not reviewing in this batch, but we'll get around to eventually, use the courtroom setting to examine the unreliability of memory, or the ways in which injustices can exist within justice systems. Rules of Engagement doesn't go that direction. The facts of the case aren't in dispute. There's no long-standing moral or social wrong that needs to be overturned. No systemic inequalities are being challenged. Like the episode Dax, which I reviewed in the previous video of this series, the hearing centers on one particular character, Worf in this case, but Worf's story in this episode isn't used to show us something important about a larger issue. It's used to show us something important about Worf. When Worf joined the cast of Deep Space Nine at the start of Season 4, it took a while before the producers of the show figured out what to do with him. The character dynamics of the show were well established by that point. You wouldn't want Worf to just come in and take over, but you wouldn't want Worf to just kind of be there standing around doing nothing either. How does Worf fit in? And just as importantly, if not more so, what is Worf's character arc going to be? Because this is Deep Space Nine. Characters have those here. What the producers eventually figured out is that Worf would be the guy who takes charge of the Defiant when Captain Sisko doesn't feel like handling it personally, and his character arc would be about how he deals with that new responsibility. Worf moves to Deep Space Nine from the Enterprise and transitions from a security officer to a command officer. He goes from a guy who takes orders to a guy who gives orders. That takes some getting used to. He's not immediately great at it. He's not immediately bad at it either. He just has a lot to learn. It's from that seed that the story of Rules of Engagement emerges. The script, written by Ronald D. Moore from a story by Bradley Thompson and David Weddle, crafts the scenario of the convoy battle so that both interpretations of it presented at the hearing seem reasonable. When Chapok says that Worf was reckless for shooting at a ship before he knew for sure what he was shooting at, that sounds fair, right? That's the first lesson they teach you during firearms training. Never point a gun at anything you don't intend to destroy. But on the other hand, Worf's position makes sense too. They were in the heat of battle. They were outnumbered. They were protecting a convoy, and the ships that were attacking them kept cloaking and decloaking. Can Worf really be blamed for deciding to fire on a ship that was decloaking right in front of him in the middle of a fight where enemy ships were constantly cloaking and decloaking? I mean, yeah, he can be blamed for that, but it's still understandable why he did it. Understandable from a tactical perspective and from the perspective of Worf's character. Most Worf-centric episodes on TNG were about his status as a warrior, or his relations to other Klingons, his alienation from his people. On DS9, the focus shifted to Worf's insecurities. In this episode, he finally admits, privately, to Captain Sisko, that he does feel like he has something to prove. That he does want to take revenge on the Klingons who have rejected him. And that chip on his shoulder led him to make a choice that, in any other circumstance, would have made him guilty of an atrocity. Worf is ultimately not responsible for destroying a ship full of civilians, but not because of anything he did or any choice he made. Because, fortunately for him, the ship full of civilians was just a hoax. His hands are clean, but only by chance. It comes perilously close to feeling like a cop-out, but I think they get away with it. The writers of Deep Space Nine walked this fine line on a regular basis. They want to get away from the everybody is a perfect hero standard imposed on TNG. They want to make the heroes of DS9 fallible and more morally ambiguous, so they have Worf blow up a ship full of civilians. But they don't want to make Worf into a monster or a fuck-up with hundreds of innocent lives on his conscience, so they split the difference and have him think he blows up a civilian ship, only it turns out to be a prank pulled by the Klingons to make Worf and Starfleet look bad, and also possibly as a pilot for a revival of Punk'd. The episode has strengths beyond the characterization of Worf. I like Ch'Pok a lot. It's a minor stroke of genius to create a Klingon lawyer who throws himself into adversarial court proceedings with the same vigor that other Klingons throw themselves into brawls and space battles. Ch'Pok is played by Ron Canada, and he is very good at conveying the character's mix of intellect and zeal. Not zeal for a cause, but zeal for victory. He's smart and also utterly shameless, often simultaneously. Like when he nonchalantly introduces evidence stolen from Worf's private files, knowing that all he has to do in order to get it admitted is challenge Worf's integrity a little bit. And it works. Like he knew it would. Sisko is also excellent here. He's stuck in the conventional role of the captain in these sorts of episodes, defending his officer, because he's not just a captain, he's a lawyer. He does his best to represent Worf during the hearing, sending Odo out to investigate the case, resolutely arguing that Worf was completely in the right to act the way he did on the Defiant, and that his character and judgment are above reproach. Then, when the hearing is over, we find out how he really feels about what Worf did. When Worf says, "I should have checked the target," Sisko spits back, "You're damn right you should have checked." And that's the first time in the episode when we've seen Sisko appear to be anything other than fully supportive of Worf. It's something he's been holding in the entire time, because up until now, his duty, as he sees it, has been to protect Worf. Now, with that job done, his duty is to make sure that Worf knows how badly he fucked up, and how lucky he is that it wasn't a lot worse. I already mentioned it during the plot summary, but I also really like the technique of having the characters address the camera when we're seeing the visualizations of their testimony. It helps to make those scenes a bit more dynamic and interesting. One of the potential flaws of the episode is that so much of what we're watching is stuff that's already happened. Almost everything important to this story has already occurred, weeks in the past, by the time the bits we get to see happen. An episode composed mostly of characters telling us about stuff that happened already, even if that testimony is visualized, runs the risk of feeling dull and pointless, especially when the details of the events described aren't even in dispute in the present. Rules of Engagement uses the direct-to-camera narration to lend an immediacy to those scenes and to make them interactive between the character testifying and the character questioning them. This episode is directed by LeVar Burton, who has directed 29 Star Trek episodes, including 10 episodes of Deep Space Nine. Rules of Engagement might be his best work as a director. So much of this episode takes place in that hearing room. Yes, there are the visualized bits of testimony and a handful of other scenes that take place in other locations, but those are all fairly brief. The bulk of the episode is characters sitting at tables, taking turns sitting in a chair, asking and answering questions. It's a challenging location in which to set most of an entire episode. Because of the way the story is structured, there aren't even opportunities to informally section it off into mini locations, like how Sidney Lumet did for 12 Angry Men, using every inch of that jury room, staging one conversation between characters in a corner, and another over by a window, and another in the bathroom, and so on. That doesn't work here, because the wardroom set, where the hearing takes place, is empty except for the necessary tables and chairs and is pretty uniform. Burton manages to make it visually interesting without ever coming across like he's trying too hard. He does it by finding creative ways to shoot the most interesting feature of the set: the characters. The questioning of each witness is shot in a different way, with camera placement, angles, and blocking unique to that sequence. The amount of work that must have gone into planning each interview scene is obvious, and it pays off. Rules of Engagement is just a really well put together episode. That's what it comes down to. It's not as thematically ambitious as some other Star Trek Courtroom episodes, but it's extremely well directed, features a singularly memorable guest character in Ch'Pok, and puts the spotlight on Worf in a way that lets us know we need to be paying attention to him, because in more ways than one, he's not on the Enterprise anymore. Those are my thoughts on Rules of Engagement. What do you think of this episode? Please share your thoughts with me in the comments. If you'd like to support this channel, and I sure wish you would, if you can afford it, you can do so by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Steve Shives, becoming a channel member by clicking the join button, or by making a one-time gift by clicking the thanks button, or via PayPal or Venmo. Links are in the description. Please join me next time as we wrap up this batch of reviews of Courtroom episodes with a show from Star Trek Enterprise. It's an episode from Season 2 of that series, and it's titled, appropriately enough, Judgment. That's next time. See you then. Thanks for watching, and take care, everybody.